We are interrupting the show for a special report.
Because now it is time for Bag Lab.
All right, so for Bag Lab this week, this is sort of a continuation from the Bag Lab from 2 weeks ago where I was discussing the cargo pockets. I promised I would follow that up with a demonstration on different styles of flaps. And so that is today's episode of Bag Lab. So I've linked to in the description. Danny, I'm going to have Danny switch to the overhead camera. I created a PDF file with 10 different styles of flaps. So it's 8 pages to print, nothing to tape together. But all of the different styles of flaps, depending on what your needs are, if you want one with curves, with some straight edges. And I went ahead and cut all these out before the show just so I could show you all the different styles. This one's sort of a diagonal style flap. I tried to hit as many different sort of types as possible. And then I'm actually going to demonstrate sewing 2 of these live on the show tonight. So, all right, so just a mention about these different styles of flaps. Depending on your needs, you can increase or decrease these pieces while you're printing. And I do have a link to a video that I previously filmed about increasing or decreasing pattern pieces. And what else was I going to say about that? I've also linked to the video for the cargo pocket in case you're interested in pairing a flap with a cargo pocket. The cargo pockets will be part of the demonstration for tonight. So I'm going to do demonstrate 2 different kinds of flaps. Here's the cargo pocket from previously where the cargo pocket was the entire width of the bag. This is just the front of the Baker Street bag, which is a free pattern and video. So as you can see, the top edge of this cargo pocket was finished, and then raw edges were left on the sides and the bottom, and it was just sewn to the body of the bag. So that's the first style I'm going to sew and discuss on the show. And then the second style, again from the cargo pocket demonstration, was when the cargo pocket was completely finished. So meaning no raw edges on the cargo pocket. And I'm going to do the same thing for the flap. No raw edges will be present on the finished flap. So since I previously assembled the cargo pocket, the female portion of the magnetic snap was attached to the actual cargo pocket. And before the show, I went ahead and installed the male portion of the magnetic snap into the lining piece. So the piece that will be closed against the cargo pocket. And I used my rivet press because I have some magnetic snaps that are installed via a rivet press. I added shape flex and fusible fleece. Fusible fleece is cut smaller. I have a little square of Decovil Heavy. You can use Peltex also just to reinforce the snap. And if you wish also, you can fuse a little piece of Pellon shape flex over that metal just to kind of cover it. That's completely optional, but I just wanted to mention how I prepped the pieces before I got started with sewing. And I'm going to start with this flap. For this particular flap, I'm going to leave the top edge raw because I'm going to sew that to the top of the bag. And what I did was I used this particular pattern piece and I kind of took a look at everything before I started. I generally like to install the flap part of the magnetic snap 1 inch up from the bottom edge of the flap. That's pretty much my go-to. It keeps it out of the seam allowance, but closer enough to the bottom edge that it's easy to grab and open and close. And for that, I just needed to modify my pattern piece. So what I did was I kind of held my pattern piece on the center of the snap that was already existing. I made a note of where 1 inch was up from the bottom edge of the flap, and then this orange line that I drew, that's where I made a note of where I wanted to cut the flap off so that I could sew it to the top edge. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sewing these 2 pieces together. I'm going to sew them right sides together just along the side and bottom edge. So I'm going to leave the top edge unsewn. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my Wonder Clips to hold those layers in place. And I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew this using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so since there's a curved edge over here, I'm going to make little notches just where the curve is. So cutting a little V within the seam allowance, again, being careful not to cut into your stitches, and do the same thing for this side over here. And then I'm just going to turn everything right side out. I like to use a turning tool just to kind of, this is the precision turning tool. I've got a link to this in the description. I just kind of like to drag it on the inside. Just kind of pushes everything out nicely. Okay, so you'll give this a press, and then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew the entire outer edge. I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to 3 millimeters just to get a nice top stitch, and I'm also going to sew the raw edge down. It just helps keep the layers in place so that things don't shift when I go to sew it to the top of the bag. Okay, so I'm moving back over to the sewing machine. I'm increasing my stitch length. Okay, so this flap is completed. I usually like to give it a press, keeping it away from the magnetic snap. And then all you need to do is, Danny, do you mind zooming out just for 1 second? Thank you. So this is the piece with the cargo pocket attached to it already. I'm just gonna go ahead and snap that flap into place and then pin the top edge, and then this top edge, I'm just going to sew it using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that finishes the flap onto the cargo pocket. Actually, I think that style of flap is a really good match for the cargo pocket. I think it looks really nice. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to the second style of cargo pocket, and this flap just needs to be sewn a little bit differently. Instead of just sewing the sides and the bottom, we're going to sew all 4 edges and leave an opening at the top for turning. So I wanted to demonstrate both, just so you could see how both different types of pockets are finished. I decided to use a different style for this particular flap, and how I came up with, I cut it just a little bit smaller, as you can see by my orange line. This is where I folded it back before placing it on the fold. So what I did was I looked at my cargo pocket, and I wanted it to be about the same width. And so what I did was I lined up the paper pattern piece on the center of the magnetic snap, and I measured, and let me grab my ruler. I measured the side edge, and my goal was to get the side of the paper 1/4 of an inch bigger than the finished pocket, so that if I sewed this using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, in theory, when the flap is done, it should be the same width as the pocket. And I wanted it to kind of fold over, so I also measured it so that I would have enough fabric so that it could fold over. A second option for a flap like this is to make it shorter so that it's just actually top stitch. So there's 2 different ways. I'll talk about both once I get this particular flat fabric sewn. So I got my exterior and my lining. I'm going to place those right sides together, and this time we're going to sew the sides and the bottom, except we need to sew at least 1 inch in along the top edge. So what I usually like to do, just because sometimes I forget when I get over to the sewing machine, I'm going to make a mark about 1 inch in from each of the side edges, and so we're going to start sewing at that mark and work the way around, and that will leave us an opening along the top edge for turning everything right side out. Okay, back to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to turn it back to my regular stitch length. Okay, so I'm gonna have Danny zoom in a little bit. So we're gonna leave the notches like we did with the other flap, and also I'm going to cut on a diagonal, but without cutting the stitches. That helps reduce bulk also in the top corner. And then you'll cut V's in both of the bottom curved edges. Okay, so I'm going to turn everything right side facing out, and I'm going to use that same precision turning tool to poke out the corners and kind of glide it along the curved edges as well. I like this tool a lot because it has this little round ball. I've actually never seen it poke through the fabric, which is what would happen sometimes with my previous turning tool. Okay, so for this particular style of flap, you're going to press the opening toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. So I'm just finger pressing on set, but you'll actually be using your iron for that. And for the top stitching, we're actually only going to top stitch the sides and the bottom. We're going to leave the top edge, the top straight edge of this flap for finishing that once we attach it to the body of the bag. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. Again, I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3 millimeters. And again, just sewing the sides and the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to pull this cargo pocket piece back out. Thank you, Danny. You read my mind. So as I mentioned before, there's a couple different ways that this could be attached. This way won't make much sense for my example just because I kind of calculated it for an alternate method, but just pretend like your bag piece is bigger. So you can either snap the flap into place and stitch directly across the top, stitching through your exterior fabric. What I accommodated for this particular pattern, actually let me leave the wonder clips on there for a second, is for the pocket to fold over before it attaches to the pocket. So I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and move that down. So I'm going to take my ruler and measure. That's about 1/2 inch. Same thing on the other side. So you want to make sure it's straight. Usually I like to use a chalk. I like using Clover Choco to draw a straight line. Just to keep it moving for the show, I'm just going to go ahead and eyeball it over here. So I usually like to have 2 lines of stitching in this particular type of flap. So I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the straight edge, and I'm also going to sew 1/4 of an inch away. It just gives some extra stability to the flap. So I'm going to do my best to hold this into place. You can use some traditional pins too if you'd like. And I'm just going to go ahead and take it over to the sewing machine. All right, I've still got it at that 3 millimeter stitch length. And make sure you especially backstitch really well. And then here goes the second line of stitching. Okay, so here is what the finished flap looks like, and when I kind of bring it down to meet the cargo pocket, and then the pocket's finished. So I'm really happy with the 2 different styles of flap that I chose for each different application. I think it really shows off that particular pocket really well. And again, the link to the printable 10 styles of flaps are in the description, and I really try to tailor my demonstrations so that they can fit an array of projects. I feel like if I make the demonstrations generic, like not for a particular bag, but for whatever you choose to use it for. I feel like it gives you, kind of puts the creativity in your hands. And so I hope I've given you, through those two examples, some ideas for adding either pockets or flaps to bags that you make in future. And hope you enjoyed this demonstration. It was a lot of fun to work on. So I'm going to be answering some questions live in just a minute.